because in the famine, in the second year, Joseph arranges for Jacob and his family to come and settle in the land of Goshen. And in this field, Jacob built a house. This is the reconstruction from the movie of Jacob's house. It's what we call a mittelsaal house, which is the earliest form of the so-called four-roomed house or Israelite house. If I put a plan up, you can see that it's basically an open room or courtyard surrounded by other rooms here. These are possibly for animals to be kept in this area, but the main part of the house was this here, mittelsaal house. It comes from North Syria, this design. It comes from the area where the patriarchs originated. This is the type of house you would expect a patriarch to build in Egypt. And of course, Jacob was a patriarch. And then, after a while, that house, according to the archaeology, was knocked down. The owner of the house had died, and it was decided to build a palace on top of it. And this is the floor of the palace that was excavated by the Austrians. What you see here is a mud brick floor which was painted white, and then you have the settings here for two stone bases for wooden columns to hold it up. It was basically a very, very nice audience chamber, and I'm going to show you the reconstruction from the movie again now of that Egyptian-style palace, but it wasn't built for an Egyptian, it was built for a Semite. Possibly the vizier, the northern vizier. When we look at a plan, this part over here was added later. The original facade was here, along here, and this courtyard was added later, including these two suites here, and a new entrance here. But the original part of the house was this here. This is the shot you just saw of the four column bases and the mud brick floor. This was the audience chamber to receive visitors. This was his personal washroom, and this was probably his robing room here. And this, believe it or not, was his bedroom. And this is a mud brick platform, which is the biggest bed ever found in the ancient world. You would expect that for Joseph, wouldn't you? The guy who interpreted dreams, to have the best bed in the world. Now, what struck me immediately about this, and by the way, these two suites are identical. How many sons did Joseph have? So when they were growing up and were getting their first wife, he built two apartments for them, exactly the same. No arguing. You can't have a bigger one than him. You must both have the same size apartment. And, significantly, the original facade of Joseph's palace had, you guessed it, 12 columns, representing the 12 brothers, 12 tribes. In the back garden, and this is now the palace over here, this is the model that the Austrian excavators built for the palace. You'll see a series of tombs, and I suppose you're already ahead of me. There are 12 of them. 12 main tombs, subsidiary ones, possibly for wives here, but 12 main ones. Each one had a tree planted in front of it. But you'll notice number 12 is rather different to the rest. Number 12 is a pyramid tomb. Here you see that pyramid tomb at the back of the garden, dated at the same time as the palace here. The ones that you see along the line here, and these ones are slightly earlier. By the way, those daggers that I showed you earlier on came from these tombs. Now that pyramid tomb is what we're going to concentrate on now. This is the photograph before they started to excavate down into the tomb. What you see here is a platform made of mud brick, and then on the front a base for a chapel. So you have a pyramid with a chapel in front of it. As I say, they haven't started excavating, and now the plan of it looks like this. Here's your platform base for the pyramid. Here's your chapel. And underground, underneath the pyramid, we have a mud brick vault where the burial took place. I'll explain what that is in a minute. Here they are digging down into the burial chamber. And this is all they found inside. A few broken bits of limestone and that strange thing. I'll show you the excavation of the actual tomb itself. Here we see this man in the blue galabert standing in the corner of the tomb. That's the chapel over there. There's the fragments of limestone and this large group of heavier limestone here. That is what we're going to concentrate on in a minute. And looking in the other direction, here is that object again, looking from the chapel towards the burial chamber. And in the burial chamber, all you've got is this piece of limestone and 2 more pieces of limestone from the same object. Completely empty. No bones, no mummy beads, no coffin wood, no pottery. Absolutely empty. So the archaeologists said, oh, I know why that is. Because there's a tunnel that's been dug in from the chapel into the burial chamber, and everything has been cleaned out. But then I asked BTAC, what grave robber would take the bones? What's the value of the bones to a grave robber? Doesn't work. This is not robbery. This is removal, pious removal of the body. So now the crunch time is, what is this? Well, it stood in the chapel in front of the tomb. And when they assembled the bits, it was quite clear that it was part of a human statue, the top half. But you'll notice that the whole of the face has been smashed off. This is reconstruction here. The eyes have been gouged out with an axe. Look at this massive hit on the top of the head there. But we also have a throw stick on the shoulder. I'll come back to that in a minute. If we look at the hair, beautifully coiffured, beautifully combed, and the original paint still survives on this statue, red hair, flame red hair. And on the forehead, although you can't see it too well, this is yellow paint. So yellow skin, red hair, beautifully coiffured and combed, in what we call the mushrooms hairstyle. And on his shoulder, a throw stick. Now, a throw stick is a symbol of an Asiatic or Semite. So this high official with this statue is an official of state, but he's a foreigner. He's not an Egyptian. On the back shoulder, I began to see, can you see, fragments of paint in stripes. See that one? Can you see them coming in this direction here or on the shoulders, the collar, and then they go down vertically? If I highlight that for you, just a little bit, just help you to understand it. It's a multicolored coat. So this statue, which is twice life size, seated statue, of a high official of state with yellow skin, red hair, wearing a multicolored coat in a tomb, a pyramid tomb. Now, a pyramid tomb is normally not given to a high official. In this period, only kings had pyramids. Only kings had colossal statues. No individual other than a king would have that. This guy has been honored to the highest level that a king could grant. Art historians have looked at this statue and said that it was carved and made in the royal workshops next to the pyramid of Amenemhat III. Okay, so the king ordered this statue for this individual. So let's restore his face. Red hair, yellow skin, collar, multicolored coat. And this is the reconstruction from the movie of the chapel with the statue. And if only we had the other part of this, we'd be able to read the name of the individual. And this is his name in hieroglyphs, and that's the name of Joseph in his Egyptian name. So,
David, what was Joseph's Egyptian name?
Okay, I think we've got time to do that if we go very quickly. Pharaoh gave Joseph an Egyptian name. His name, Yosef, was his original name, and then Pharaoh said, I'm going to give you a new name. Now, in tradition, in Semites living in Egypt were given a name, and they were called ex-Semitic name, he who is called, and then the Egyptian name. So you always get this he who is called phrase. Okay? So the Egyptian name in the Bible is Zaphanat Pa'anea. Okay? Now, Zaphanat Pa'anea has got metathesis. It should be as Zatanaf. Okay? So the T and the F have rotated. It's like, for instance, you'll get a Caribbean gentleman might say, ask me something, instead of ask me something. Okay? You get the inversion of the consonants. And the same thing has happened here. It's really Zatanaf, not Zaphanat. Okay? So that in Egyptian is he who is called. So the next name, Pa'anea, is the real name given to him by the king. And Pa'anea, Anea, is the vocalization, the true vocalization of the word Ankh in Egyptian, which means life, the sign of life, with a loop. So his name is the one who lives. So Joseph He was called the one who lives. Why did Pharaoh give him that name? Because Jacob came to Egypt and found the son he believed to be dead was still alive. So we'll have to move on because I'm being a bit slow. Very quickly, I want to tell you about the alphabet. This Joseph character was a genius, an absolute genius. He was in charge of pretty much everything in the land. One of the things he was due to organize was the mining of turquoise in Sinai. And this genius man, who was trained to read the hieroglyphs, write the hieroglyphs, but also being a Semite, came up with something quite extraordinary at a place called Sarabat el-Kadim, which is the main turquoise mine in Sinai, which is up the top of this mountain. I'll do this very quickly. You climb up to the heights in the middle of Sinai, and you arrive at a temple here, right on the top of the mountain. This is the temple of Hathor, who is the lady of turquoise, the goddess of the turquoise mines. These stela are all dedicated to her, and they have Semitic names on them of the workforce that was sent here to mine the turquoise. Here is Hathor, the goddess with the strange wig and the eyes, and she's called Hathor. And here we have Meket Mofkat, which is the lady of turquoise, which is her title. Here is one of the mines where they excavated the turquoise, and what Petrie found, Flinders Petrie found in here, was quite remarkable. He found a script carved on the mine face. And it's clearly hieroglyphics, but nobody could read it. It didn't read Egyptian. So Petrie was scratching his head and couldn't work it out. And then Sir Alan Gardner came along and worked out what was going on here. And he realized that it was actually Hebrew, but written in hieroglyphs. And it's called Proto-Sinaitic. So here is your Hebrew alphabet with the earliest form of writing. So what happens, for instance, I'll give you an example here. The water sign in Egyptian hieroglyphs is the word for nu, water. But in Hebrew, it's mayim. So that becomes the letter M. The house, beit, Egyptian pear. Okay, so brilliantly, he takes Egyptian hieroglyphic signs, he actually gives the Hebrew name to them, and the first letter of the Hebrew name becomes the letter of the alphabet. And it can go all the way through the alphabet, right the way down to Tav, which of course is the cross. And this one over here, Aleph, which is the ox. Let me give you an inscription from there, which you can read just about, if I highlight it. This says, Mem Aleph Ayin Mem. It's a very crude form of the word mayim, and that is a leather water bag. Water. Let's look at the letter Aleph, just to show you how that evolves into the modern alphabet. Here is our modern letter A. You can do this with all the letters of our alphabet. This is it in Phoenician, rotated 90 degrees with the cross member breaking through the diagonals. And this is it in Proto-Sinaitic from this particular cave. And if I now put the details in, it's an ox, Aleph. So we get our modern alphabet through Proto-Sinaitic, through Proto-Canaanite Hebrew, through Phoenician, through Greek to our modern alphabet. That's all down to Joseph. Joseph gave us our alphabet.
And the reason why you believe it's Joseph, why do you think that that's the case?
It requires it to be a Semite with a superb education, who was an administrator, who could write in hieroglyphs, but wanted to develop a script for writing Hebrew. Now, I would have originally thought of Moses, but we now find that these inscriptions are dated to the late 12th dynasty, which is before Moses. So it has to be somebody else. And the only person I can think of capable of doing that was the man who was the most important official in the land of the pharaohs, the vizier, capable of doing all this, who was a Semite, who lived in that palace in the eastern delta. It's logical to assume that it must be Joseph who did this. So I'll get on to Moses very quickly. Who was the Pharaoh who raised Moses in the palace? So here's the text, famous one from Exodus 1. Then there came to power in Egypt a new king who did not know Joseph. Joseph had died. Look, he said to his people, the Israelites are now more numerous and stronger than we are because they've prospered. We must take action to stop them from multiplying. Or if war should break out, they might join forces with our enemies. They might take up arms against us and then escape from the country. Accordingly, they put taskmasters over the Israelites to wear them down by forced labor. This is the introduction to Moses and his birth. They've prospered, they've got numerous, they've become powerful, and we've seen that because in the 13th dynasty, most of the officials were Semitic. They weren't Egyptians. In fact, even some of the pharaohs were Semitic at that time. One of the most telling and saddest things about the archaeological excavations at Tel Adaba Avaris is they found hundreds of tiny graves. These are mud bricks here, so that's a little baby. All over the site. Now, in most ancient sites, infant burials represent around 25% of the cemetery population. In other words, 1/4 of most graves you find in the ancient world belong to infants, 1 year old or less. In this site at Avaris, infant burials represent 50% of the total cemetery population. There is a massive doubling of the number of infant burials. And then, with the remaining adult population that are left over, of the remaining adult burials, there are 3 females to every 2 males. That tells me that these infants are mostly male, because there's a skew in the population. These slaves go from being 50-50 male and female to a strong bias towards female in adulthood. And we know what that story is. Now, there is a writer, a Jewish historian called Artaparnas of probably Iranian extraction. We believe he might have been from Persia. And he actually wrote a history of the Jews for the Greek pharaohs, the Ptolemies. And his history was placed in the Alexandrian Library. Then, of course, later on the Christians came along and burnt it to the ground, and we lost his original manuscript. We've never been able to recover that. However, other people, other scholars, quoted from him extracts from his history of the Jews. And he tells us the Pharaoh who raised Moses in the palace. Even though the Bible just says Pharaoh, he names him. Now remember, he's writing in Greek for his Greek masters, the Greek pharaohs, the Ptolemies. This is what he calls the Pharaoh who raised Moses. Chenofres. 3 elements. Chenofres. We can translate that back into Egyptian as Cha-Nephre, or Cha-Nofre. That is the name of just 2 kings of ancient Egypt. One in the Old Kingdom, which doesn't count, and this guy. Cha-Nephre Sobekot IV is one of only 2 kings in the entire history of Egypt with this prenomen. In other words, the coronation name. So this is the name Artaparnas gives to the Pharaoh, and we can identify him with this king called Sobekot IV. Here he is. He's the most powerful pharaoh of the dynasty, the 13th dynasty. Here are statues of him from Karnak. He is the 29th ruler of the 13th dynasty. I'm very quickly going to show you his position. But he probably had a summer palace like this one at Avaris, where he would have met, or Moses would have been raised, and then perhaps in the confrontations of the Exodus, this had been the place where those confrontations would have taken place. If you look at the site again from a different angle, you can imagine, here's Pharaoh's palace and the temple. You can imagine the princess bathing in the water here, or coming out to bathe in the water here. And down here, the baby Moses being placed in his basket, and then the water taking him towards the palace where he would have been found by Pharaoh's daughter. When you get the archaeological evidence, you can start to see the story evolving and working. So Moses was then raised in the palace of Chenofres. He would have been an educated man, learning hieroglyphs, etc. Here we see a fragment of the royal canon of Turim, which is a king's list of the pharaohs. And here we get this last sub-dynasty that enslaved the Israelites. Sobekot III, we have a Brooklyn papyrus with slave lists with Semitic names in there. And then we have Neferhotep, a very powerful king, and Sobekot IV, who was the one who was the stepfather rather, of Moses. When he died. There's the start of the 13th dynasty. When he died at the bottom of the papyrus, the 29th king, we come to the next column over here. We need to be looking for the Pharaoh of the Exodus. So if I go 45 years down, it's approximately 45 because we don't have the exact dates, we come to this little fragment of the papyrus here and the name Dudimose. Remember that name because he's the Pharaoh of the Exodus, not Ramesses II. This nobody. This guy who nobody's ever heard of. He's virtually the last king of the 13th dynasty. And it's his time when this happens according to Manetho. Have you heard of Manetho? He's the Egyptian priest who wrote a history of the Egyptians who mentions, quoted in Josephus, who mentions this. And this is quite striking. In the time of a king called Ptolemaeus, remember he's writing in Greek again for the Ptolemies, Ptolemaeus is Dudimose. In his reign, for what cause I know not, a blast of God smote us. And God here is in the singular. You would expect an Egyptian to be writing, and the gods smote us. But he doesn't. He refers to one God smiting the Egyptians. And he continues, and kai in Greek, which means what follows on from God smiting. Unexpectedly, from the regions of the east across the Sinai, invaders of obscure race marched in confidence of victory against our land. By main force, they easily seized it without striking a blow. And having overpowered the rulers of the land, they then burned our cities ruthlessly, razed to the ground the temples of the gods, and treated all the natives with cruel hostility, massacring some and leading into slavery the wives and children of others. That is the punishment of Egypt. That is post-Exodus, the invasion of the Hyksos, coming into Egypt, being able to take over the land without striking a blow. There is no army to defend Egypt. Why? It's at the bottom of the sea. Otherwise, Egypt would have been defended by the army. And at this very moment, at the city of Avaris, Toledaba, in stratum G1, the Austrians came across scores of pits in the ground, shallow pits, with bodies thrown in on top of each other. Look how this guy's leg lies across this guy's chest. This one is flat on his back. That one's on his stomach. Here's another example. This guy's just literally been tossed into the grave and his arms fallen forward. Betak, the excavator, says what happened in Egypt at this moment was a terrible plague struck the place. And the people died. And they had to bury them in emergency burials for fear of contamination of the survivors. And right afterwards, the entire Asiatic quarter of the city vanished. They simply closed their doors and they left. And for a period, we're not too sure how long, maybe 5 years, 6 years, the place was left with drifting sand. And then in came the Hyksos and occupied the site and completely bulldozed it flat and built a mortuary cult on top of this site, where they buried the Hyksos kings. At the end of stratum G, marking the end of the 13th dynasty, the main Tel area was abruptly abandoned and the Semitic population vanished. So here we are, this is the location now we're dealing with. We're not saying Ramesses in the 19th dynasty was the Pharaoh of the Exodus. We're saying it happened down there under Dudimose at the close of the 13th dynasty. And this, 40 years later, or approximately 40 years later, is when we should be looking for a Jericho that was destroyed. And then we have the Egyptian collapse with the Hyksos dominating the country for 2 centuries before the recovery in the 18th dynasty. So, we're not going to deal with where they went, because that's for the next film. So I'm going to very quickly jump forward to the conquest. And I should be able to wrap this up within the time we've got left. So remember our chart. We have the Iron Age town built by Hiel on the body of his 2 sons in the time of Ahab, circa 800 BC. Then we have, going backwards, the 600-year gap at Jericho. Then we have the destruction of the Middle Bronze Age city, destroyed by Joshua.
And Dave, what you're saying is that this Dudimose and the end of his kingdom and the dark, or the second intermediate period, is right there. That is
right at that spot. The second dark age hits in right at that spot.
Okay.
And it's caused by the Israelites and God, destroying the Egyptians. The walls collapse at Jericho. There's heavy burning of the site, and the site is abandoned, as I say, for 600 years, just as in the biblical story. Joshua 6:20 and 26. When the people heard the sound of the trumpet, they raised a mighty war cry, and the wall of Jericho collapsed then and there. At once the people stormed the city, each man going straight forward, and they captured the city. And at that time Joshua made them take his oath before Yahweh. Accursed before Yahweh be the man who rises up and builds this city. On his firstborn will he lay his foundations. On his youngest son he will set up its gates. Exactly as happens with Hiel in the Iron Age 1b, the new city is built, and he sacrificed his 2 children as foundation deposits for the building of the new city in the time of Ahab and Omri. So if we look at Jericho, this is looking down on Jericho, excavated in the 1950s by Kathleen Kenyon. I'm going to take you to this trench that she dug. She dug several trenches, but this is one that I studied myself. Here is the trench during the excavations. You see she dug right down into the tell. Here's me examining the stratigraphy, because when you cut down into a trench, you can see the different layers, one on top of the other. And what I'm going to show you now is the structure of the defensive system, which is a foundation of the wall that's on the top of the tell here, a sloping rampart made of plaster, a glacis we call it, at the bottom a revetment wall made of stone. And so it's virtually impossible to attack this monstrous structure, these high walls that you see at Jericho in the Middle Bronze Age. Let me put together on top of that the existing structure, which has now disappeared. So you have the revetment wall made of stone at the bottom, you have the plastered slope, glacis here, and you have the city wall at the top. And when Kathleen Kenyon excavated this, she found the wall had collapsed and had rolled down and ended up at the bottom. The mud bricks from the top wall ended up at the bottom. The walls came tumbling down. And then they set the thing alight and burnt the whole city to the ground. So again, this is the wonderful reconstruction from the movie. When the archaeologists were excavating the houses, they found large storage jars full of grain. This grain was heavily charred from burning. But what this tells us is when the attack took place, when the destruction took place, it took place shortly after Passover, because that's when the harvest is brought in from the Jordan Valley. And we know it wasn't a long siege because the jars are still full. It must have been a very short siege of the city. What does the Bible tell us? 7 days. If we move on to Hatzor, very important site, the greatest or foremost of the kingdoms, according to the Bible. It was the royal citadel of a king called Jabin, who was the top knob of the area. Joshua 10:11. Joshua then turned back and captured Hatzor, putting its king, called Jabin, to the sword. Hatzor in olden days was the foremost of those kingdoms. In compliance with the curse of destruction, they put every living creature to the sword. Not a living soul was left, and Hatzor was burnt to the ground. It suffered the same fate as Jericho. There were 2 or 3 major cities that suffered the same fate. What's key for me is the name of the king that Joshua personally thrust his sword into. When they were excavating it, and they're still excavating it, this is the late Bronze Age palace up here, but if you go deep, deep down below that, they exposed the corner of the Middle Bronze Age palace. This is the time when Jericho was destroyed. This is the time when Hatzor was destroyed. And in that area there, this is the corner of the building, they turned up a fragment of a tablet. In cuneiform, Akkadian, because this was the lingua franca of the region. This is how diplomats wrote to each other at this time. And this is actually a letter addressed to a king of Hatzor. And do you want to know what his name is? He's called in Canaanite and Akkadian Yabni. And Yabni is biblical Jabin. So the king who lived in this palace at the Middle Bronze Age that was burnt to the ground and destroyed has the same name as the king that Joshua slaughtered and burnt the city to the ground. How specific do you want me to get? I'm going to finish now with a very, very important site, Shechem. Here is the great Migdol fortress of Shechem with a great cyclopean wall sweeping around. the temple of Baal-berith, Lord of the Covenant. The foundations are here, facing east. And in front of it, in the courtyard, this has been excavated away. It was originally all at this level. Standing in front of the temple is this big white stone. If we look at it from another angle, as I say, this has been excavated, so this is actually modern support here. It was originally all at this level. There is the temple of Baal-berith, the great Migdol temple. There is the standing stone. If I reconstruct it using the reconstruction from the movie, you get a better impression.
David, what is this near? What two mountains is this near?
Oh, they are called Gerizim and Nebal. Is that right? Ebal. That being Gerizim on that side. So we have the oak tree. We have the tower temple, the Migdol temple of Baal-berith, the Lord of the Covenant. We mustn't say Baal because it doesn't mean Baal, the evil Baal. This is the word for Lord in this particular case. The covenant of Abraham we're talking about here. And the standing stone. Who set the standing stone up? Joshua. So there is Joshua's standing stone in front of the temple. Still there to this day in the reconstruction I'll show you later. Sometime later, about 100 years later or so, there was a king of Shechem called Abimelech. And he was a pretty bad character. And he decided to attack the city and kill everybody in the city. And this is a reconstruction of the fire of destruction which burnt this temple to the ground. And this is the text from that. Judges 9:45-49. All that day Abimelech attacked the town. He stormed it and slaughtered the people inside, razed the town and sowed it with salt. On hearing this, all the leading men inside Migdol Shechem took refuge in the crypt of the temple of Baal-berith. Abimelech's men piled branches over the crypt and set it on fire over those who were inside, so that all the people in Migdol Shechem died, about 1,000 men and women. And what does archaeology show us? That this temple was destroyed by fire about 100 years later, exactly matching the story in the Bible, the book of Judges. So, this monolith here is one of the most important artifacts from the Bible. Joshua 24:25-28. That day, Joshua made a covenant for the people. He laid down a statute and ordinance for them at Shechem. Joshua wrote these words in the book of the law of Yahweh. He then took a large stone and set it up there under the oak tree in Yahweh's sanctuary. Joshua then dismissed the people, everyone to his own heritage. This was the renewal of the covenant, and that is the covenant stone of Joshua. If you go to Nablus today, ancient Shechem, you see that standing there, stone daubed in Intifada graffiti by the youths, and then painted over in yellow paint to cover what they've written on it. Standing there forlorn, not recognized by anybody. The Israelis don't recognize it. The archaeologists don't recognize it for what it is. It's so obvious what it is, but of course, it's 300 years too early to be Joshua's standing stone. So it can't be. Now there cannot be the temple which Abimelech destroyed and burnt to the ground. So, let's look at our wall of time one more time. Now, when we didn't have any matches over here in the 19th dynasty or the 18th dynasty, suddenly we have a perfect match between the arrival of Joseph and Jacob in the Middle Kingdom towards the end of the 12th dynasty. The growth and multiplication of the city of Avaris, so it becomes one of the biggest cities in the ancient world, teeming with Semitic peoples. Suddenly a slavery comes along. A change of dynasty happens where you get this sub-dynasty of major strong pharaohs who are native Egyptians who decide to enslave the population. We see it in the bones of the burials. We see it in the children, the infants that are buried, the massive increase in the burial of infants. And then we see the death pits at Avaris. And suddenly the whole population of Semites leaves the city and disappears. And then immediately following that, the Hyksos arrive, invade Egypt, and literally take over the place for 2 centuries, brutalizing the Egyptians. And finally, 40 years afterwards, in the Middle Bronze Age here in Canaan, we have a destruction of Jericho, where the walls fell down, where the city was burnt to the ground, and was abandoned for 600 years, where Jabin was killed at Hatzor, where the site of Shiloh was founded for the ark for the very first time, and where at Shechem we find the covenant stone of Joshua erected by the leader of the Israelite tribes. I don't know how I can make it more factual than that. I don't see how anybody could ignore that evidence. I really don't.